You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen everything. But on a cold February morning, a woman walked into my courtroom who reminded me why I still put on these robes every single day. What she told me, the reason she was standing before me, it broke my heart into pieces. And when I delivered my verdict, when I said those words out loud, I had to fight back tears in front of everyone. Let me tell you exactly what happened that day, because this is a story about love, sacrifice, and what truly matters when we're faced with the hardest moments of our lives. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a municipal court judge in Providence, Rhode Island for 40 years now. Every morning I wake up at 6:15, same time I've been waking up since 1984. My wife Joyce makes coffee, strong and black, exactly the way I like it. We sit together for 20 minutes, just talking about the day ahead, about our grandchildren, about life. It's our routine, and at 78 years old, I've learned that routines matter. They keep you grounded. My father came to this country from Italy with $8 in his pocket and a belief that America was a place where hard work and honesty mattered more than anything else. He worked construction his entire life, came home every night with concrete dust in his hair and cement under his fingernails. But he always told me something I never forgot. He'd say, "Frank, the measure of a person isn't what they have. It's what they do when things get hard. It's how they treat people when nobody's watching." I think about those words every single day when I walk into my courtroom, because that's what I do there. I measure people, not by their bank accounts or their clothes or their connections. I measure them by their character, by their honesty, by their humanity. And after 40 years, I can usually tell within the first 30 seconds what kind of person is standing before me. That particular morning in February was cold. I remember because I had to scrape ice off my windshield before driving to the courthouse. I got there at 8:15, like always. Christina, my court clerk, she's been with me for 17 years. She knows me better than I know myself sometimes. She had my coffee waiting on my desk, and she'd already organized my case files for the day. I sat down and started going through them. Traffic violations mostly, illegal parking, expired meters, a few moving violations. Nothing unusual, just regular people who made mistakes, who forgot to feed a meter or parked in a loading zone for 5 minutes. These are the cases I see every day, and I approach each one the same way. I listen. I try to understand. I try to be fair. But something felt different that morning. I can't explain it exactly. Maybe it's intuition you develop after 4 decades of doing this work. Maybe it's just an old man's instinct, but I had this feeling that something significant was going to happen. At 9 o'clock sharp, I walked into my courtroom. I always take a moment before I sit down at the bench. I look around at the room, at the seal of Rhode Island on the wall, at the American flag in the corner. I remind myself what this place represents: justice, fairness, equal treatment under the law. No matter who you are, no matter where you come from, in my courtroom, you get the same respect and the same fair hearing as everyone else. Christina called the first case. It was a parking ticket, illegal parking in a hospital zone. I looked down at the name on the docket, Sarah Martinez. I watched as a woman in her mid-30s walked up to the podium. She was wearing nurse's scrubs under a winter coat. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying recently. Her hands were shaking slightly as she held a folder of papers. I could tell immediately that she was nervous. I've seen that look thousands of times. People get intimidated by courtrooms, by judges, by the formal setting. I tried to put them at ease right away. I said, "Good morning, Ms. Martinez. How are you today?" She looked up at me, and I saw tears starting to form in her eyes. She said, "Your Honor, I've been better." Her voice cracked a little when she said it. I looked down at the ticket information. She'd been cited for parking illegally in a hospital emergency zone. It was a clear violation, no question about that. The fine was $85, but I've learned over the years that there's always a story behind these citations. always a reason, and my job isn't just to collect fines. My job is to understand what happened and to apply justice with compassion. I said to her, "Tell me what happened that day. Why were you parked in the emergency zone?" She took a deep breath. I watched her compose herself, trying to keep her emotions under control. She said, "Your Honor, my father was dying. He had stage 4 cancer and the hospital called me at work. They told me I needed to come immediately. They said I might not have much time." I felt my chest tighten when she said those words. I have children. I have grandchildren. I understand what it means to get that phone call, that moment when everything else in the world stops mattering. I leaned forward and I said, "Go on, please." She continued, and I could see her struggling to get the words out. She said, "I drove straight from my shift at the clinic where I work. I'm a nurse, Your Honor. I parked in the first spot I could find. I didn't even look at the signs. I just ran inside because I was terrified I wouldn't make it in time. I held her gaze and I asked her, 'Did you make it in time?' She nodded and tears started rolling down her cheeks. She said, 'I got to hold his hand. I got to tell him I loved him. He passed away 20 minutes after I arrived.' The courtroom was completely silent. I glanced over at Christina, and I saw she was wiping her eyes. I looked back at Ms. Martinez, and I said, 'I'm so sorry for your loss.' 'How long ago did this happen?' she said. 3 weeks ago, Your Honor. I've been trying to handle everything. The funeral arrangements, settling his affairs, helping my mother. I honestly forgot about the parking ticket until I got the court notice. I picked up the citation and I looked at it again. $85. That's what the city wanted from this woman who had just lost her father. This woman who worked as a nurse, who spent her days caring for other people. This woman who had parked illegally for one reason, and one reason only, because she was racing to say goodbye to her dying father. I thought about my own father in that moment. I thought about the day he died, 23 years ago. I thought about how I would have torn down every wall and broken every rule to get to his bedside in time. I thought about what matters in this life and what doesn't, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I looked at Sarah Martinez and I said, "Ms. Martinez, I want you to listen to me carefully. You did nothing wrong. You parked your car so you could be with your father in his final moments. That's not a violation in my eyes. That's love. That's what children are supposed to do." I picked up the citation and I held it up so she could see it. Then I said, "This ticket is dismissed. You owe nothing. Go home to your mother. Be with your family. And please accept my deepest condolences." She just stood there for a moment, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then she said, "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you so much." Her voice was barely a whisper. I watched as she walked out of the courtroom, and I saw her pause at the door to wipe her eyes. That's why I do this job, for moments like that, when I can use this position to show a little mercy, a little understanding, a little basic human compassion. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to break a rule for something more important, where you had to choose between what's technically right and what's morally necessary? Leave me a comment, because I actually read them. And if you're enjoying this story, hit that like button for me. I took a 5-minute recess after that case. I needed to collect myself, to refocus. These emotional cases, they take something out of you, but in a good way. They remind you why this work matters. I went back to my chambers, drank some water, looked at a photo of my grandchildren I keep on my desk. Then Christina knocked on the door and said we were ready for the next case. I walked back into the courtroom and I noticed something different. There were more people in the gallery than before. Word must have spread about the case I'd just dismissed because I could see people whispering, pointing at me. I took my seat at the bench and Christina called the next case. That's when everything changed. That's when I met someone who would remind me what true sacrifice looks like, what real character means. Christina read the name from the docket, Jennifer Chen. Parking violation, hospital zone, same location as the previous case. I looked up and I watched as a young woman approached the podium. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old. She was wearing a McDonald's uniform under her jacket. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and her hands were clutched around a small purse. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. I said, "Good morning, Miss Chen." She looked at me and said, "Good morning, Your Honor." Her voice was soft but steady. I appreciated that. She wasn't putting on a performance. She was just being herself. I looked down at the citation. Same violation as the previous case. Illegal parking in a hospital emergency zone. Same date, actually. Same hospital. The fine was $85. I had a feeling I knew what this was about, but I wanted to hear it from her. I said, "Tell me what happened. Why were you parked in that emergency zone?" She took a breath and she said, "Your Honor, my father was in the hospital. He was dying. I got a call from my mother saying I needed to come right away." I felt that same tightness in my chest again. Another daughter racing to her father's bedside. Another family in crisis. Another parking ticket written by someone who was just doing their job but couldn't possibly understand the circumstances. I said, "Did you make it in time?" She nodded and said, "Yes, Your Honor." I got there about 10 minutes before he passed. I started to reach for my pen to dismiss this ticket just like the previous one. But then she said something that stopped me cold. She said, "Your Honor, I need to explain something else. My father, he didn't have insurance. He was undocumented. He came to this country 30 years ago and he worked construction his whole life. He paid taxes, he followed the rules, but he never got his papers sorted out. He was terrified of hospitals because he thought they might report him." I leaned back in my chair. This wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore. This was about a family living in the shadows, afraid of the very systems that were supposed to help them. I said, "Why are you telling me this?" She said, "Because I want you to know why the bill was so high." He waited until he was so sick that there was no choice but to go to the emergency room. By then it was too late. The hospital did everything they could, but the cancer had spread too far. I asked her, "How much was the medical bill?" She looked down at her hands and said, $63,000, Your Honor. I felt my jaw clench. $63,000. For a family that was clearly struggling. For a man who had worked his entire life in this country, but had fallen through every crack in our system. I said, "How are you handling that?" She said, "I'm working 2 jobs. McDonald's during the day, cleaning offices at night. My mother works at a laundromat. We're making payments, $500 a month. It'll take us years, but we'll pay it off." The courtroom was silent again. I could feel everyone listening, hanging on every word. This young woman, this 25-year-old kid, was working herself to exhaustion to pay off a medical bill that shouldn't have existed in the first place. And now she was standing in front of me, worried about an $85 parking ticket. I looked at her and I said, "Ms. Chen, why did you park in the emergency zone?" She said, "Your Honor, I was scared. I was crying. I couldn't see straight. I just wanted to get to my father. I didn't even notice where I parked until I came out 3 hours later and saw the ticket on my windshield. I picked up the citation and I held it in my hand. I thought about my father again. I thought about the values he taught me. Work hard, be honest, treat people with dignity. Take care of your family." This young woman was doing all of those things. She was working 2 jobs. She was honoring her father's memory by paying his debts. She was taking care of her mother, and she had come to court not to make excuses, but to take responsibility. I said, "Ms. Chen, let me ask you something. When you got this ticket, when you got the notice to appear in court, what did you think?" She said, "I thought I'd have to pay it. I thought maybe I could ask for a payment plan because $85 is a lot for me right now. But I knew I was parked illegally. I knew I had to face the consequences. That's when I knew. That's when I understood exactly who was standing before me. This wasn't someone looking for a handout. This wasn't someone trying to dodge responsibility. This was someone who understood that actions have consequences, but who also deserved to be met with understanding and compassion." I looked directly at her and I said, "Ms. Chen, your father would be very proud of you. You're working 2 jobs to honor his memory. You're taking care of your mother. You came to court today prepared to accept responsibility. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." I paused and I saw her eyes widen slightly. I said, "This ticket is dismissed. You owe nothing. Take that $85 and put it toward your father's medical bills." Her hand went to her mouth, and I saw tears start streaming down her face. She said, "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you so much." I said, "No, Ms. Chen, thank you. Thank you for reminding me what matters. Go take care of your mother, and please know that your father's legacy lives on in you." She walked away from the podium, and I watched as an older woman in the gallery stood up and embraced her. Her mother, I assumed. They held each other and they cried together right there in my courtroom, and I'm not ashamed to tell you that I had to take a moment to compose myself. Christina handed me a tissue. She knows me well enough to know when I need one. I'm going to be honest with you. At this point, my heart was full but also heavy. Full because I'd been able to help 2 families in real distress. Heavy because I knew these weren't isolated cases. There were thousands of people just like Sarah Martinez and Jennifer Chen, people doing their best, working hard, trying to do right, and getting crushed by circumstances beyond their control. If you've ever felt that frustration, if you've ever wished you could do more to help, you know what I'm talking about. Hit that like button if you're still with me, and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next, what I learned about these cases, it changed how I saw everything. I took another short recess. I needed to clear my head. I went back to my chambers and I sat down at my desk. I thought about those 2 women, Sarah Martinez and Jennifer Chen, 2 daughters who had done exactly what anyone would do. They had raced to be with their dying fathers. They had parked illegally because in that moment, parking laws were the furthest thing from their minds. And they had both received citations from parking enforcement officers who were just doing their jobs but couldn't have known the circumstances. Christina came into my chambers with my next case file. She set it down on my desk, and she said, "Judge, this next one is different." I looked up at her and said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Same location, same date, but this one you're going to want to see for yourself." I picked up the file and I read through it. Another parking violation. Same hospital, same emergency zone, same day. The name on the citation was Rebecca Morrison, but there was a note attached from the parking enforcement officer. It said, cited vehicle was a BMW. Driver was inside hospital for 14 minutes. Witness driver exit through main entrance, not emergency room. Driver was on cell phone and smoking a cigarette. I felt something shift in my chest. This was different. This wasn't a desperate daughter racing to a deathbed. This was something else. I said to Christina, 14 minutes? She nodded. She said, "That's what the officer noted. He timed it because the vehicle was parked directly in front of the emergency entrance, blocking access." I walked back into the courtroom with that file in my hand. I had a bad feeling about this one. After 40 years, you develop an instinct for these things. You can sense when something isn't right. I sat down at the bench and I said, "Next case." Christina called Rebecca Morrison. I watched as a woman in her 50s walked toward the podium. She was wearing expensive clothes, designer coat, leather boots, large handbag with a logo I recognized. She walked with a certain confidence, a certain bearing that comes from privilege. I've seen it before. There's nothing wrong with success, nothing wrong with having money. But there's a way wealthy people sometimes carry themselves that tells you everything about how they view the world. She stood at the podium, and she didn't look nervous at all. Actually, she looked annoyed, like being in my courtroom was an inconvenience. She was checking her phone as Christina read the charges. I said, "Ms. Morrison, please put your phone away. This is a courtroom." She looked up at me, and I saw her expression, not apologetic, not respectful, irritated. She put the phone in her purse and she said, "Your Honor, I'm here about a parking ticket. Can we make this quick? I have a nail appointment at 11. I felt my jaw tighten. I looked down at the citation and I said, "Ms. Morrison, you're charged with parking illegally in a hospital emergency zone. That zone exists so ambulances can access the emergency entrance. Your vehicle was blocking that access. Do you understand the seriousness of this?" She actually waved her hand dismissively. She said, "Your Honor, I was only there for a few minutes. I had to run in and drop something off. It wasn't a big deal." I leaned forward and I said, You were there for 14 minutes, according to the officer's notes, and you blocked emergency vehicle access. That is a big deal. Someone could have died because an ambulance couldn't get through." She rolled her eyes. I saw it clearly. She rolled her eyes at me. She said, "Nobody died, Your Honor. It's just a parking ticket. I'll pay the fine. How much is it?" I looked at her and I said, "The fine is $85. But this isn't just about money, Ms. Morrison. This is about safety and common courtesy." She opened her expensive handbag and she pulled out a wallet. She said, $85? That's nothing. I spend more than that on lunch. She actually started pulling out cash right there. I said, "Ms. Morrison, put that away. You don't pay me directly, and I haven't decided what the penalty will be yet." She looked surprised. She said, "What do you mean you haven't decided? Isn't it just a standard fine?" I said, "I have discretion in these matters, and I'm trying to understand why you thought it was acceptable to park in an emergency zone. What were you dropping off that was so important?" She hesitated for a second. Then she said, "I was bringing my mother her iPad. She'd forgotten it at home, and she wanted it for her hospital stay." I said, "Your mother was admitted to the hospital?" She nodded. I said, "For what reason, if you don't mind me asking?" She said, "She had a hip replacement scheduled, elective surgery." I sat back in my chair. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. I said, "Your mother was having elective surgery, not an emergency, and you parked in the emergency zone, blocking ambulance access to bring her an iPad?" She said, "She was bored, Your Honor. She wanted to watch her shows." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I looked at her and I said, "Ms. Morrison, in the past hour, I've had 2 women stand where you're standing. Both of them parked in that exact same zone. Both of them were racing to their father's deathbeds. Both of them made it just in time to say goodbye. Both of them were devastated, grieving, heartbroken, and both of them came here prepared to accept responsibility for their actions." She just stared at me. I continued. I said, "You parked in that same zone to deliver an iPad to your mother who was having elective surgery, and you seemed completely unbothered by the fact that you could have prevented an ambulance from saving someone's life. Do you understand the difference?" She said, "Your Honor, with all due respect, I don't think those other cases have anything to do with mine. Rules are rules. I broke a rule. I'm willing to pay the fine. Can we please move on?" I felt my blood pressure rising. I had to take a deep breath. I said, "You're right that rules are rules, but I also consider circumstances. I consider character. I consider whether someone understands the impact of their actions." She said, "Your Honor, I'm a busy person. I have a business to run. I have appointments I really need to get going. Can I just pay the fine and leave?" That's when I saw it. That's when I understood exactly who I was dealing with. This wasn't someone who made an honest mistake. This was someone who believed money solved everything. Someone who thought laws were for other people. Someone who had never faced real consequences for anything in her life. I looked at her and I said, "The fine for this violation is $85. But given your attitude, given your complete lack of remorse, given the fact that you blocked emergency access for a non-emergency reason, I'm not simply going to let you pay and walk away. I'm going to require you to complete 8 hours of community service at that same hospital. You'll work in the emergency room so you can see firsthand what happens when ambulances need access." Her mouth dropped open. She said, "Community service? Your Honor, I don't have time for that. I have a business. I have a schedule." I said, "Then you should have thought about that before you parked illegally. 8 hours of community service to be completed within 30 days. If you fail to complete it, the fine increases to $500. She looked at me with an expression I'd seen before: shock, anger, disbelief. She said, "This is ridiculous. I want to appeal this." I said, "That's your right. The information for filing an appeal is available from the clerk's office. Next case." She stood there for another moment, like she couldn't believe what had just happened. Then she grabbed her bag and she stormed out of the courtroom. I heard the door slam behind her. She just stared at me. I continued. I said, "You parked in that same zone to deliver an iPad to your mother who was having elective surgery, and you seem completely unbothered by the fact that you could have prevented an ambulance from saving someone's life. Do you understand the difference?" She said, "Your Honor, with all due respect, I don't think those other cases have anything to do with mine. Rules are rules. I broke a rule. I'm willing to pay the fine. Can we please move on?" I felt my blood pressure rising. I had to take a deep breath. I said, "You're right, that rules are rules. But I also consider circumstances. I consider character. I consider whether someone understands the impact of their actions." Her mouth dropped open. She said, "Community service?" "Your Honor, I don't have time for that. I have a business. I have a schedule." I said, "Then you should have thought about that before you parked illegally. 8 hours of community service to be completed within 30 days. If you fail to complete it, the fine increases to $500. She looked at me with an expression I'd seen before. Shock, anger, disbelief. She said, "This is ridiculous. I want to appeal this." I said, "That's your right. The information for filing an appeal is available from the clerk's office. Next case." She stood there for another moment like she couldn't believe what had just happened. Then she grabbed her bag and she stormed out of the courtroom. I heard the door slam behind her. The courtroom was buzzing. People were whispering, looking at each other. I banged my gavel and I said, "Order, please. Let's move on." But inside I was shaking. Not from anger exactly, from frustration, from the unfairness of it all. 2 women who had parked illegally for the most heartbreaking reason imaginable, and they had been humble and respectful and accountable. 1 woman who had parked illegally for the most trivial reason possible, and she had been entitled and dismissive and contemptuous. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on her? Or not harsh enough? Should I have shown more mercy? I genuinely want to know what you think. Leave me a comment because I read every single one, and if you're still with me, if this story is making you think about justice and character and how we treat each other, hit that subscribe button right now. I finished the rest of that morning's docket. More traffic violations, a few small claims cases, routine matters. But I couldn't stop thinking about those 3 women, about the stark difference between them, about what it says about our society that some people face tragedy with grace and others face inconvenience with indignation. I went home for lunch that day, like I usually do. Joyce made soup and sandwiches. I sat at our kitchen table and I told her about the cases. She listened, like she always does. When I finished, she said, "You did the right thing, Frank, with all of them. Sometimes mercy is justice, and sometimes accountability is justice. You have to know which is which." That's why I've been married to this woman for 48 years. She understands. She gets it. She knows that this job isn't about blindly following rules. It's about wisdom. It's about discernment. It's about treating each person as an individual human being with their own story and their own circumstances. I went back to the courthouse for the afternoon session. Christina met me at my chamber's door. She said, "Judge, you need to see something." She handed me a piece of paper. It was an email that had been forwarded to her from the hospital administrator. I read it carefully. It was a thank you note from Sarah Martinez, the nurse whose father had died. She had written to the hospital administrator to praise the care her father had received. And at the end of the note, she had mentioned her court appearance. She wrote, "Judge Caprio showed my family more kindness in 5 minutes than I knew existed in the justice system. He saw me as a human being, not just a case number. Please thank him for me." I felt tears prick my eyes. Christina said, "There's another one." She handed me a second email. This one was from Jennifer Chen's mother. It was shorter, written in broken English, but the sentiment was crystal clear. She wrote, "God bless Judge Caprio. He helped my family when we have nothing. He give us hope. Thank you, thank you, thank you." I sat down at my desk and I just held those emails. This is why I do this. This is why I still get up at 6:15 every morning after 40 years. Because sometimes, just sometimes, you can use this position to make someone's terrible day a little bit better. You can remind someone that the system isn't entirely broken, that there are still people who care, that kindness still exists. Christina said, "Judge, there's something else." Rebecca Morrison filed her appeal. I looked up and said, "That was fast." She said, "She had her lawyer file it this afternoon. They're arguing that the community service requirement was excessive and punitive." I shook my head. Of course she did. Of course she couldn't just accept responsibility and complete 8 hours of service. That would require humility. I said to Christina, "Let it go through the appeals process. Whatever happens, happens." I made my ruling based on what I believed was fair. If a higher court disagrees, so be it. That's how the system works. She nodded and left my chambers, but I sat there thinking about it, thinking about how some people will spend more time and money fighting accountability than it would take to just do the right thing. 3 weeks went by. I handled hundreds of cases. Life in the courtroom continued as normal. Then one afternoon, Christina knocked on my door during a recess. She said, "Judge, Jennifer Chen is here. She wants to speak with you if you have a moment." I said, "Of course. Send her in." Jennifer walked into my chambers, looking different than the last time I'd seen her. She still looked tired, but there was something else, something lighter in her expression. She said, "Your Honor, I hope it's okay that I came by. I just wanted to thank you in person." I stood up and I shook her hand. I said, "You didn't need to do that, Ms. Chen, but I'm glad you did. How are you doing?" She said, "I'm okay. Still working both jobs, still making payments on my father's bills. But something happened that I wanted to tell you about. The hospital called me last week. They said that a portion of my father's bill had been paid off by an anonymous donor. $20,000, Your Honor. Just like that." I felt my eyes widen. I said, "That's wonderful. Do you have any idea who it might have been?" She shook her head. She said, "No idea. The hospital said the donor specifically requested to remain anonymous. But, Your Honor, it made me think. It made me believe that there are good people in this world, people who help for no other reason than because it's the right thing to do." I smiled at her. I said, "Your father raised a remarkable daughter. You honor his memory every day with your hard work and your character." She thanked me again and left. After she walked out, I sat there thinking about that anonymous donation, $20,000. Who would do that? Who would pay off a stranger's medical debt and ask for nothing in return? 2 days later, I got my answer. I received a phone call in my chambers from the hospital administrator. She said, "Judge Caprio, I'm calling about the Jennifer Chen situation. I wanted you to know that the anonymous donor has come forward and given us permission to reveal their identity." I said, "Who was it?" She said, "It was Sarah Martinez, the nurse whose father passed away the same day." I sat back in my chair, stunned. Sarah Martinez, the woman who had just lost her own father, who was grieving and heartbroken. She had taken her own money, probably savings she'd been building for years, and she'd used it to help another family in the same situation. I said, "How did she even know about Jennifer Chen?" The administrator said, "She was in the courtroom that day. She heard Ms. Chen's case. She said it reminded her of her own situation and she wanted to help." I hung up the phone and I just sat there for several minutes. This is what humanity looks like. This is what we're capable of when we lead with compassion instead of selfishness. Sarah Martinez had turned her own grief into action. She had taken her pain and transformed it into help for someone else. This is the kind of story that restores your faith in people. Hold on. Before I tell you what happened with Rebecca Morrison's appeal, I need you to make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Because what I learned next, what came out during that appeal process, it shocked me after 4 decades of doing this work. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. And hit that like button if these stories are touching your heart like they touched mine. Rebecca Morrison's appeal hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after my initial ruling. I had to appear to defend my decision. Her lawyer argued that community service was an excessive penalty for a simple parking violation. He said I had abused my discretion as a judge. He said I had been arbitrary and capricious. I sat there listening to this attorney talk about his client like she was some kind of victim, like I had been unfair to her. And I thought about Sarah Martinez and Jennifer Chen. I thought about the actual victims, the people who suffer while others coast through life thinking rules don't apply to them. When it was my turn to speak, I laid out my reasoning clearly. I explained that I consider not just the violation, but the circumstances and the character of the person before me. I explained that Ms. Morrison had shown no remorse, no understanding of why her actions were dangerous. I explained that community service would give her perspective that simply paying a fine could never provide. The appeals judge asked me questions. He asked if I had applied the community service penalty to the other two defendants in similar situations. I said no, I had dismissed their tickets entirely because their circumstances were completely different. They were racing to deathbeds. She was delivering an iPad. He asked if that was fair, to treat similar violations differently. I looked him right in the eye and I said, "Justice isn't about treating everyone identically. It's about treating everyone fairly." Those two women showed remorse, accountability, and had legitimate emergency circumstances. Ms. Morrison showed none of those things. That's why I ruled differently. That's called judicial discretion, and I exercised it appropriately. The appeals judge took 2 weeks to issue his ruling. When it came down, I'll admit I was nervous. I thought there was a real chance he might overturn my decision, but he didn't. He upheld my ruling entirely. He wrote that trial judges are granted discretion for exactly this reason, to consider individual circumstances and to fashion appropriate remedies. He said my decision was well within the bounds of that discretion. I found out later what happened next. Rebecca Morrison's lawyer advised her to just complete the community service rather than appeal further. The cost of additional appeals would have far exceeded the value of 8 hours of her time, so she agreed. Reluctantly, but she agreed. I never saw her again after that initial court appearance. I didn't supervise her community service. That wasn't my role. But about 2 months after the appeals decision, I received a letter. It was from the hospital volunteer coordinator. She said she was writing to tell me about Rebecca Morrison's community service. The letter said that Ms. Morrison had completed her 8 hours. She had worked in the emergency room waiting area, helping families, directing them to the right places, bringing them coffee and blankets, and according to the coordinator, something had changed. In the letter, the coordinator wrote, "I've supervised hundreds of community service workers. Most of them just put in their hours and leave. But Ms. Morrison stayed an extra hour on her last day. She said she wanted to see something through with a family she'd been helping." The coordinator described what happened. A family had been waiting for hours to hear about their grandfather who'd had a heart attack. They were terrified, and Rebecca Morrison had sat with them. She had brought them food from the cafeteria. She had talked to them, comforted them. When the doctor finally came out with good news, the grandfather would survive, Rebecca had cried along with them. The coordinator ended her letter by saying, "I don't know what you said to Ms. Morrison in your courtroom, Judge Caprio. But whatever it was, it made an impact. She told me on her last day that she'd never seen that side of the hospital before. She'd never understood what emergency really meant. Thank you for sending her to us." I sat in my chambers reading that letter, and I felt something I don't often feel in this job: vindication, not because I'd been proven right, but because someone had actually learned something, someone had actually changed. That's rare, that's special, that's what this whole thing is supposed to be about. You know what keeps me doing this job after 40 years? Moments like these, seeing that people can grow, seeing that the law, when applied with wisdom and compassion, can actually make a difference. If this story is restoring your faith in justice, show me by hitting that subscribe button and that like button. Share this with someone who needs to see it. About 4 months after all of this happened, I was having dinner at a local Italian restaurant with Joyce. It's our favorite place, family-owned, been there for 30 years. We were sitting at our usual table when I saw someone walk in. It was Sarah Martinez, the nurse whose father had passed away. She saw me and her face lit up. She walked over to our table and said, "Judge Caprio, I'm so sorry to interrupt your dinner. I just wanted to say hello." I stood up and I gave her a hug. I said, "Please don't apologize. How are you doing? How's your mother?" She said, "We're doing better. Still grieving, but better. And Your Honor, I wanted to tell you something. I got promoted at work. I'm a head nurse now. The extra money is helping us pay down my father's bills faster. I congratulated her and I said, "You earned that promotion through your hard work and your character. Your father would be so proud." Then she said something that I'll never forget. She said, "Your Honor, that day in your courtroom changed my life. Not because you dismissed my ticket, because you saw me as a human being. You treated me with dignity when I felt like the world was crushing me. I'll never forget that kindness, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to pay it forward." After she left, Joyce looked at me and she said, "That's the impact you have, Frank. You don't always see it, but it's real. It matters." I sat there thinking about her words, about how small acts of kindness create ripples we can't always track, about how treating people with basic human decency shouldn't be exceptional, but in our world it often is. A few weeks after that, I got another surprise. I received a letter at the courthouse addressed to me personally. The return address was from Jennifer Chen. I opened it carefully and I read it. She wrote about how her life had changed since that day in court. She had gotten a better job, working as a medical assistant at a clinic. Her mother had been able to cut back her hours at the laundromat. They were still making payments on her father's medical bills, but with Sarah Martinez's donation and their increased income, they could see the end in sight. But what struck me most was something she wrote near the end of the letter. She said, "Your Honor, you made me believe in America again. My father came to this country with nothing. He worked so hard, but he was always afraid of being sent away, afraid of asking for help. He died believing he didn't belong here. But you showed me that there are people in this country who see us as human beings, who understand that we all deserve dignity and fairness. Thank you for giving me hope." I folded that letter carefully and I put it in a drawer in my desk where I keep special things, letters from people I've helped over the years, photos of my family, awards and recognitions that matter to me. These are the things that remind me why this work is important, why showing up every day at 78 years old still matters. Not long after that, I was invited to speak at a community event about justice and compassion in the legal system. I don't usually do public speaking outside the courtroom, but this felt important. It was organized by a local nonprofit that helps immigrant families navigate legal and medical systems. I said yes. On the night of the event, I walked into the venue, and I was shocked by how many people were there, hundreds of people packed into this community center. I gave my speech about what I've learned in 40 years on the bench, about how the law is supposed to serve people, not the other way around, about how we all have an obligation to see each other as human beings first and everything else second. After the speech, there was a reception. People came up to thank me, to tell me their stories, to shake my hand, and then I saw them. Sarah Martinez and Jennifer Chen, together. They had become friends after everything that happened. They came up to me as a pair, and Jennifer said, "Your Honor, Sarah and I wanted you to know that we're volunteering together now, at the hospital, helping families who are going through what we went through." Sarah added, "We want to be for other people what you were for us, someone who shows up with compassion when the world feels cruel." I stood there looking at these two remarkable women, and I felt tears in my eyes. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I'm 78 years old. I've earned the right to cry when something moves me. I think about that day in February all the time, about those three women who walked into my courtroom with parking tickets, about how differently they responded to the same situation, about what it revealed about character and privilege and humanity, about how my small decisions that morning created ripples that extended far beyond what I could have imagined. This is what 40 years of experience teaches you. Every case matters. Every person matters. The way you treat someone in your courtroom might be the only kindness they receive that day. The dignity you afford them might be the only dignity anyone has shown them in years. And your decision might impact not just them, but everyone they touch going forward. My father used to tell me that you're only as good as how you treat people who can't do anything for you, people who have no power, no money, no connections. That's the real test of character, and that's what I try to remember every single day when I put on these robes and walk into that courtroom. I've learned that mercy and accountability aren't opposites. They're partners. You show mercy to those who deserve it. You hold accountable those who need it, and you use wisdom to tell the difference. That's what judges are supposed to do, not just apply rules blindly, but apply wisdom thoughtfully. I've also learned that you can't save everyone. You can't fix every injustice. You can't solve every problem, but you can show up every day and try. You can treat each person with respect. You can listen to their stories. You can use whatever power you have to make their situation a little bit better. And if you do that consistently, year after year, decade after decade, it adds up to a life well lived. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on Rebecca Morrison or not harsh enough? Should I have shown her the same mercy I showed the other two women? Should I have treated all three identically regardless of circumstances? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? How do you balance mercy and accountability? How do you decide who deserves compassion and who needs consequence? These aren't easy questions. I've been wrestling with them for 40 years and I still don't have perfect answers. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. People share incredible insights and stories down there. It's become a community of people who care about justice and fairness and treating each other with basic human decency. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. These stories need to be told. These lessons need to be shared. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, someone who believes that character matters more than cash, someone who understands that how we treat each other during the hardest moments defines who we are as a society. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. It's about a father who did something extraordinary for his daughter, and about how one act of love changed everything. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless. That's what makes this country work. That's what my father believed when he came here with $8 and a dream. That's what I try to honor every time I put on these robes. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about these issues. Thank you for being part of this community of people who still believe in fairness and compassion and human dignity. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.